Disclaimer: this video contains words that are Turkish, Serbian and many others, so if I get them wrong I am very sorry, as I do not speak any languages apart from English. You may have a go at me in the comments if you desire. Hello and welcome back. This is History with an Australian and I am the Australian. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Eastern Crisis. The Great Eastern Crisis of 1875 to 78 began in the Ottoman Empire's territories on the Balkan Peninsula in 1875, with the outbreak of several uprisings and wars that resulted in the meddling of international powers, and was ended with the Treaty of Berlin in July 1878. Now let's go talk to the background of the events leading up to the Great Eastern Crisis. The state of the Ottoman administrations in the Balkans continued to deteriorate throughout the 19th century, with the central government occasionally losing control over whole provinces. Reforms imposed by European powers did little to improve the conditions of the Christian population, while at the same time managing to dissatisfy a sizable portion of the Muslim population. Bosnia suffered two waves of rebellion by the local population, with the most recent being in 1850, in the prelude to this crisis. Meanwhile, Austria consolidated after the turmoil of the first half of the century, and sought to reinvigorate its long-standing policy of expansion at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. While the nominally autonomous and de facto independent principalities of Serbia and Montenegro also sought to expand into regions inhabited by their compatriots, as well as national and irredentist sentiments were strong enough and were encouraged by Russia and its agents in many of the regions across the Balkans. On the 24th of August 1854, during the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire took its first of many foreign loans. The empire entered in subsequent loans, partly to finance the construction of railways and telegraph lines, and to partly finance the deficits between the revenues and the lavish spending and expenditures of the imperial court, such as the construction of new palaces on the Bosphorus Strait in Constantinople. Some financial commentators have noted that the terms of these loans were exceptionally favourable to the British and French banks, which were owned by a certain family, the Rothschilds, which facilitated them. A large amount of the money was also spent on building new ships for the Ottoman navy, which during the reign of Sultan Abdulaziz in 1875 consisted of 21 battleships, 173 warships of other types, which made it the third largest naval fleet in the world after those of the British and French. All of these expenditures, however, put a huge strain on the Ottoman treasury, and in the meantime a severe drought in Anatolia in 1873 and flooding in 1874 caused famine and widespread discontent in the heart of the empire. The agricultural shortages precluded the collection of necessary taxes, which forced the Ottoman government to declare a sovereign default on its foreign loan repayments on the 30th of October 1875, and increased taxes in all of its provinces, including the Balkans. The decision to increase taxes for the paying of the Ottoman Empire's debt to foreign creditors resulted in outrage in the Balkan provinces, which culminated in the Great Eastern Crisis and ultimately the Russo-Turkish War, that provided independence or autonomy for the Christian nations in the Empire's Balkan territories, with the subsequent Treaty of Berlin in 1878. The war, however, was disastrous for the already struggling Ottoman economy, and the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established in 1881, which gave control of the Ottoman state revenue to foreign creditors. This made the European creditor bondholders and gave them assumed rights and special rights to the OPDA for collecting various types of tax and custom revenues. During and after the Serbian-Ottoman War of 1876-78, between 30,000 and 70,000 Muslims, mostly Albanians, were expelled by the Serb army from the Sanic of Nice and fled to the Kosovo Vilayet. I'll get more into this later into the video. Age of Chaos and Blood. Now I will give a comprehensive list of all the major rebellions and conflicts and provide a brief description of them all. I'll also talk about some of the major wars and treaties and their aftermaths and effects and how they continued in the timeline. Now, if I miss any major events or do not go into enough detail in your opinion on what I should have done on certain uprisings, it is because I do not think they came to overall affect the overall timeline and the events. And there were quite a few minor ones that were crushed pretty quickly. So if I offend anyone, I apologize. You can have a go at me in the comments. The Herzegovinian Uprising. The Herzegovinian Uprising was an uprising led by the Christian population, mostly Serbs, in the region of Herzegovina against the Ottoman Empire, which is why it has its name. But from there it also spread into Bosnia and Rasak. It broke out in the summer of 1875 and lasted in some regions up to the beginning of 1878. It was followed by the Bulgarian uprising and would ultimately be absorbed into the Serbian and Montenegrin Ottoman wars. The uprising was precipitated and was caused by the harsh treatment under the rules and laws of the local rulers of Bosnia. The reforms, which were meant to help the Christian populations and improve the empire, which were announced by the Ottoman Sultan, which involved new rights for Christian subjects, such as a new basis for army conscription and a much-hated end to the tax farming, were either resisted or ignored by the powerful Bosnian landowners. They frequently resorted to more oppressive measures against their Christian subjects to keep them in line and to increasing their own wealth. As such, the tax burden and the standard of life for the Christian peasants were constantly getting worse and more oppressive. The rebels, once their rebellion began, were immediately aided with weapons and volunteers from the principalities of Montenegro and Serbia, whose governments officially jointly declared war on the Ottomans on 18th of June 1876, which led to the Serbian-Ottoman War and the Montenegrin-Ottoman War. Now this rebellion would continue, but it would mostly be absorbed by these wars from between the Serbians and Ottomans. As the Serbians marched in, the rebels would ultimately side with the Serbians and help them defeat the Ottomans, and most of Herzegovina and other lands would be absorbed into Serbia and Montenegro towards the end. But the rebellion did continue, although I will not talk about it in further detail here, as the Serbian-Montenegrin wars will be covered in much greater detail later on in the video. The April Uprising in 1876 was probably one of the most important uprisings of the Great Eastern Crisis, as it was this uprising that drew international attention to it, due to the harsh and absolutely barbaric practices of the Ottoman army when putting down this rebellion. The April Uprising was called the Bulgarian Horrors or the Bulgarian Atrocities in Britain. It was an insurrection organized by Bulgarians in the Ottoman Empire which only lasted from April to May of 1876, which was brutally suppressed. It indirectly resulted in the re-establishment of Bulgaria in 1878, as the regular army had basically militia groups of the local population which supported the empire to brutally suppress, destroy, and annihilate groups of opposition. This resulted in a public outcry in Europe, with many famous intellectuals condemning the atrocities committed by the Ottomans, and began to support and call for the aid of the suppressed Bulgarian population. The Razovsky Insurrection, 1876. The work on its preparation began in 1875 in Thessaloniki. A revolutionary group was created there that took the decision to organize an anti-Ottoman insurrection. Basically, this group consisted of the activists of the Association of the Bulgarian Dawn. The leader of the group was Dmitry Popagayov, excuse the pronunciation. The preparations for this rebellion began in late 1875 in the village of Valosi. But however, after the outbreak of the pre-mentioned April uprising, the Ottoman police in the region cracked down, and a number of arrests were made by the Ottoman authorities in late April. Because of this, the revolt broke out prematurely on the 7th of May in Valosi. Two revolutionary bands of about 60 people captured the village for a short time, and then the rebellion would spread to towns around it, including Marshalo and Prunetz. However, the revolt was quickly suppressed by local military units, and many of the rebels were killed or arrested. The few remaining survivors would escape into the nearby mountains, but no further action was possible, and the insurrection came to an end, although these survivors would survive until the end of the war and the crisis, and many of them would turn to their towns. Now I'm going to give a brief description of the Serbian-Turkish Wars, as I'll go into greater detail on the actual events of the wars in the Montenegrin section, which will come after this. The Serbian-Turkish Wars began in 1876 and lasted until 1878, but as you can tell there is an S at the end of wars, which means there were actually two. The two consequential wars began in 1876 and the first one ended in 1877, but a second one would begin in the same year of 1877 and last until 1878. They were fought between the Principality of Serbia and the Ottoman Empire in conjunction with the Principality of Montenegro, with Serbia declaring war on the Ottoman Empire on the 30th of June. But this would end because of the intervention of major European powers, which made a ceasefire which was concluded in autumn, and the Constantinople Conference was organized. A peace was signed on the 28th of February 1877 on the basis of status quo ante bellum. After a period of formal peace, Serbia declared war on the Ottoman Empire again on the 11th of December 1877. Renewed hostilities last until February of 1878. The final outcomes of the war was decided by the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Serbia gained international recognition as an independent state, and its territory was expanded. The war coincided with the Bulgarian uprising, the Montenegrin Ottoman War, and the Russian-Turkish War, which we will talk about soon. The Montenegrin Ottoman Wars of 1876 to 1878. The Montenegrin Ottoman War, also known in Montenegro as the Great War, was fought between the Principality of Montenegro and the Ottoman Empire, quite clearly. The war ended with a Montenegrin victory. 6 major and 27 smaller battles were fought, along with the crucial Battle of Vučić. A rebellion in nearby Herzegovina, the pre-mentioned Herzegovinian uprising, that sparked a series of rebellions and uprisings against the Ottomans in Europe. Montenegro and Serbia agreed to declare war on the Ottomans on the 18th of June, 1876. The Montenegrins allied themselves with the Herzegovinians. One battle that was crucial to Montenegro's victory in the war was the Battle of Vučić. In 1877, Montenegrins fought heavy battles along the borders of Herzegovina and Albania. Prince Nicholas took the initiative and counterattacked the Ottoman forces that were coming from the north, south, and west. He conquered Šišnak on the 24th of September 1877, Bar on the 10th of January 1878, Unic on the 20th of January 1828, Guzmaz on the 26th of January, and Viana and Lecendro on the 30th of January. Excuse the god-awful pronunciation of those words. The war ended when the Ottomans signed a truce with the Montenegrins at Edirne on the 11th of January 1878. The advancement of Russian forces towards the Ottoman forces forced the Ottomans to sign a peace treaty on the 3rd of March the same year. They recognized the independence of Montenegro as well as Romania and Serbia, and also increased Montenegrin's territory from 4,405 square kilometers to 9,475 square kilometers. Montenegro would also gain many of the pre-mentioned towns and cities that were captured by Prince Nicholas, as well as access to the sea. Now I'll go into greater detail of the Battle of Vrdo. The battle would happen near the town of Nizic in Herzegovina, and the result of it was very clearly a decisive, absolutely crushing victory for the Montenegros and Herzegovinians. The Montenegro and Herzegovinian rebels went up with about a force of 1,400 combatants against an army that is nearly double their size, with 45,000 combatants. The Montenegrins had 17 battalions, the Herzegovinians had 11, and they had brought 4 cannons with them. The Ottoman army, under the command of Ahmed Mahtar Pasha and Osman Nuri Pasha, had 24 battalions and 11 cannons. 12 cannons. But the battle would be a decisive victory for the Montenegrins, with Prince Nikolai I leading his forces to crush the center of the Ottoman forces and in the process killing Selim Pasha. This would lead to a mass rout and would utterly destroy the Ottoman army and their strength in the Balkans. This, with not only being a victory of a much smaller force against a much larger, only left about 70 killed on the Montenegrin side and 118 wounded, while around 4,000 Ottoman soldiers were lost. Next, I'm going to touch on a thing called the First Constitutional Era, which began in 1876 and lasted until 1878. The First Constitutional Era of the Ottoman Empire was a period of constitutional monarchy, following the proclamation of Kurum Aziz, meaning basic law or fundamental law in Ottoman Turkish, written by members of the Young Ottomans, that began on the 23rd of December 1876 and lasted until the 14th of February 1878. These young Ottomans were dissatisfied by the Tismat and instead pushed for a constitutional government similar to that in Europe. The constitutional period started with the dethroning of Sultan Abdulaziz. Abdul Hamid III took his place as Sultan. The era ended with the suspension of the Ottoman Parliament and the constitution by Sultan Abd Hamid II, which restored his own absolute power as an absolute monarch. The Constantinople Conference began in 1876 and lasted until 1877. The Constantinople Conference of the great powers of Britain, Russia, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy was held in Constantinople from the 23rd of December of 1876 until the 20th of January 1877, following the beginning of the Herzegovinian Uprising in 1875 and the April Uprising in April 1876. The great powers agreed on a project for political reforms in Bosnia and in the Ottoman territories, including with the majority Bulgarian population. The conference envisioned a creation of an autonomous province, including Bosnia and most of Herzegovina, while the southern part of the latter was to be ceded to the Principality of Montenegro. The great powers agreed on substantial Bulgarian autonomy to take form of 2 new Ottoman provinces, which were established for the purpose of creating a good state for the Bulgarians to be happy with within the empire. The next thing we're going to talk about is probably the most major war of the Great Eastern Crisis. This war is the Russo-Turkish War. It began in 1877 and lasted until 1878. The Russo-Turkish War was a conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Orthodox coalition, led by the Russian Empire, and composed of the regions that have formed Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro. It fought in the Balkans and the Caucasus. It originated emerging in the 19th century of Balkan nationalism. Additional factors include Russian goals of recovering territorial losses during the Crimean War, and re-establishing itself in the Black Sea and supporting the political movements attempting for a free Balkan nations from the Ottoman Empire. The Russian-led coalition won the war, pushing the Turks all the way back to the gates of Constantinople. But the timely intervention of the Western European great powers stopped Russia being able to seize the city, and probably realize their goals of taking it and turning it back into an Orthodox city. As a result, Russia succeeded in claiming the provinces of Caucasia, namely Kars and Batum, and also annexed the Bajuk region. The principalities of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, also of which had de facto sovereignty for some time, formally proclaimed independence from the empire. After almost 5 centuries of Ottoman domination, a Bulgarian state re-emerged with the Principality of Bulgaria, covering land between the Danube and the Balkan Mountains, except northern Dobruja, which was given to Romania. This would quite famously lead to some interesting events later along down the line of Balkan history. But also the region of Sofia, which became the city's new capital. This war would also become known as the Romanian War for Independence, which I will go to talk on now. The Romanian War for Independence. Now, I'm only going to lightly touch on this subject, as the Romanian War of Independence is extraordinarily closely linked with the Russian-Turkish War, and therefore does not really need its own section, but I'll give a brief description of it. On April the 16th, 1877, Romania and the Russian Empire signed a treaty at Bucharest, under which Russian troops were allowed to pass through Romanian territory, with the condition that Russia respected the integrity of Romania. Consequently, the mobilization of Romanian troops also began, and about 120,000 soldiers were amassed in the south of the country to defend against an eventual attack of Ottoman forces from the south of the Danube. On April the 28th, 1877, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire, and its troops entered Romania through the newly built Eiffel Bridge on their way to the Ottoman Empire. But, due to great losses, the Russian Empire asked Romania to intervene and assist them in the war. On July the 24th, 1877, the first Romanian army units crossed the Danube and joined forces with the Russian Empire's military forces. This would ultimately lead to the pre-mentioned effects and Romania achieving independence as well as to territorial expansion. The Treaty of San Stefano in 1878. The Treaty of San Stefano was a treaty between the Russian and Ottoman empires signed at San Stefano, a village west of Constantinople, on the 3rd of March 1878, by Counts Nicholas Palajov Inektiv and Alexander Needov on behalf of the Russian Empire, and the Foreign Minister Salet Pasha and Ambassador to Germany Saldur Bey on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. The treaty ended the Russo-Turkish War. According to the official Russian position, by signing the treaty, Russia never intended to gain anything more than a temporary rough draft, so as to enable the final settlement with other great powers. The treaty provided for the creation of an autonomous Principality of Bulgaria, after almost 500 years of Ottoman rule. The day that the treaty was signed, the 3rd of March, is celebrated as Liberation Day in Bulgaria. However, the enlarged Bulgaria envisioned by the treaty alarmed neighbouring states as well as France and Great Britain. As such, it resulted in it never being implemented, and was superseded by the Treaty of Berlin, which followed the Congress of the same name, that would take place 3 months later. The next topic we're going to cover is the expulsion of the Albanians. Now, the expulsion of the Albanian refers to the forced migration of Albanian populations from areas that became incorporated into the Principality of Serbia and Montenegro in 1878. But this actually did start occurring before the end of the wars and in the end treaties. As soon as the territories were conquered by the Serbian and Montenegrin troops, the population of Albanians were generally forced out along with the retreating Ottoman forces. And after the war, when the borders were defined. Serbs which were left on the outside of the borders of the new Serbian state were generally forced to migrate as well back into Serbia, which meant the Albanian refugees would generally just repopulate the villages of the Serbs which had been forced to leave. This would happen in about 30 settlements located in the central and southeastern Kosovo, which leads to the current population demographics of the region to this day. Another important side note is the Ottoman authorities had difficulties accommodating to the needs of the refugees, and the local Serbian population often committed revenge attacks, along with the Albanians committing attacks against them. So overall, the Albanian expulsion was a paramount, potentially a war crime, and definitely today would not be accepted and could definitely be considered ethnic cleansing. The next topic we're going to cover ties in with the previous topic, because it is actually the rebellion of the Serbs that were located in Kosovo, and is called the Komovo Uprising, which happened in 1878. It was an uprising of the local Serbian population, and was a movement that sought to liberate the region from the hands of the Ottoman Empire and unify it with the Principality of Serbia, which was at war with the Ottoman Empire at the time. Following the Serbian army's liberation of Nice on the 31st of December 1877, the rebellion began on the 20th of January 1878 with guerrilla operations during the army's liberation of Varenje. The rebels received secret aid from the Serbian government, and the uprising lasted 4 months before the Ottoman army was able to crush it on the 20th of May, during which the Ottomans retaliated with atrocities against the local population. The next rebellion is a rather major one. It is the 1878 Greek-Macedonian Rebellion. The rebellion, also known as the Macedonian Revolution, was launched in opposition to the Treaty of San Stefano, according to which the bulk of Macedonia would be annexed to Bulgaria, and in the favour of the union of Macedonia with the Kingdom of Greece. This rebellion would break out. This followed the brief Greco-Turkish War of 1878, which I am not going to mention in here, in which Greece had declared war on the 2nd of February against the Ottoman Empire, only for the Greek forces to return to their bases shortly after crossing the border due to the intervention of great powers after the signatures of the Treaty of San Stefano. It is reported that the revolutionary outbreaks in the same year are located along the Macedonian in Epirus, Thessaly, and Crete, seeking union with the Greek state. In Macedonia there was greater willingness and enthusiasm than in the other parts where the revolution broke out. The revolution had 2 main focuses in Macedonia. One was in Olympus and the other was in Mykonos. The Macedonian Revolution of 1878 did not achieve its purpose, but the opposition of the Greek population of Macedonia to the annexation of Greater Bulgaria was documented internationally. And also the diplomatic position of Greece and those countries opposed to the Treaty of San Stefano was strengthened, so that at the Treaty of Berlin in June, which I will mention in a bit, the Macedonian territories instead remained in Ottomans and were not annexed to Bulgaria. And in response to this, the Bulgarian population of Macedonia rose similarly in the autumn of 1878 in the regions of Kresna and Lagog, but to no avail. The next revolt I'm going to talk about is probably the most successful of the Greek Macedonian revolutions, and it is the Cretan Revolt. The Cretan Revolt was an insurrection of Cretan people against the Ottoman occupation of the island, and obviously it was centered on the island of Crete. This insurrection was part of the larger movement for independence, but it did not ultimately achieve independence, but it did achieve the Pact of Helpa, which ended it, and accorded a certain number of concessions to the Cretan people and special rights within the empire. The next thing I'm going to quickly cover is the Epirus Revolt, which was a part of the Greek Macedonian Revolution but was centered in Epirus. And ultimately, this is a very minor one, so I'll only give it a quick sentence. The Epirus Revolt started in 1878 as a part of the Greek Macedonian Revolution and was ultimately crushed very rapidly by the Ottoman forces, as it, although it was officially supported, it did not receive any backing from the Greek government. and was soon crushed as it did not have the wide support of the public. The next thing we're going to talk about is the Congress of Berlin. The Congress of Berlin, which went from the 13th of June to the 13th of July 1878, was a meeting of the representatives of the era's 6 great powers in Europe: Russia, Great Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Germany. The Ottoman Empire and 4 Balkan states: Greece, Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro. It aimed at determining the territories and states of the Balkan Peninsula after the Russo-Turkish War, and came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Berlin, which replaced the preliminary Treaty of San Stefano, which had been signed 3 months earlier between the Russians and Ottomans. The borders and results of the area of the Balkans are as follows. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who led the Congress, undertook to stabilize the Balkans, recognized the reduced power of the Ottoman Empire, and balanced the distinct interests of Britain, Russia, Austria at the same time. He tried to diminish the Russian gains in the region and prevent the rise of a Greater Bulgaria. As a result, the Ottoman lands in Europe declined sharply. Bulgaria was established as an independent principality within the Ottoman Empire. Eastern Rumelia was restored to the Ottoman Empire under special administration, and the region of Macedonia was returned outright to the Ottoman Empire, which promised reform. Romania would achieve full independence, but it was forced to turn over part of Bessarabia to Russia, but gained North Dobruja in exchange. Serbia and Montenegro finally gained complete independence, but with much smaller territories, with Austria occupying the Razak region. Austria-Hungary also would take over Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Britain would move in Cyprus. The aftermath of the peace. The results were first hailed as a great achievement in peacemaking and stabilization. However, most of the participants were not fully satisfied, and grievances on the results festered until they exploded in the First and Second Balkan Wars, and would eventually lead to the First World War. Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece all received gains that were far less than what they thought they deserved. The Ottoman Empire, then called the sick man of Europe, was humiliated and significantly weakened, which made them more liable to domestic unrest and vulnerable to attack. Although Russia had been victorious in the war that occasioned the conflict, it was humiliated, and therefore resented its treatment. Austria-Hungary gained a great deal of territory, which angered the South Slavs and led to decades of tensions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bismarck would become the target of hatred by Russian nationalists and pan-Slavists, and he later found that he had tied Germany too closely to Austria-Hungary in the Balkans. In the long run, tensions between Hungary, Austria-Hungary, and Russia intensified, as did the nationality question in the Balkans. The Congress was aimed at revising the Treaty of San Stefano and keeping Constantinople within Ottoman hands. It effectively disavowed Russia's victory over the decaying empire during the Russo-Turkish War. The Congress returned territories to the Ottomans that the earlier treaty had given to the Principality, most of Bulgaria, most notably Macedonia, thus setting up a strong revanchist demand in Bulgaria, which leads to them starting the First Balkan War. After the Treaty of Berlin in 1879, Austria-Hungary stationed military garrisons in the Ottoman vilayets of Bosnia and of Sanac of Novi Pazar, which formerly de jure continued to be Ottoman territories. Taking advantages of the chaos that occurred during the Young Turkish Revolution in 1808, Bulgaria declared its formal independence on the 5th of October 1809. The following day, Austria-Hungary unilaterally annexed Bosnia on the 6th of October, but pulled its military forces out of Novi Pazar in order to reach a compromise with the Ottoman government and avoid war. The last major campaign or revolt that we're going to talk about in this video is the Austro-Hungarian campaign in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1878. The campaign to establish Austro-Hungarian rule in Bosnia and Herzegovina lasted from the 29th of July to the 20th of October of the same year, against local resistance fighters supported by the Ottoman Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the country in two large movements, one from the north into Bosnia and another from the south into Herzegovina. A series of battles in August culminated in the fall of Sarajevo on the 19th, after a day of street-to-street fighting. In the hilly countryside, a guerrilla campaign continued until the last rebel stronghold fell and their leader was captured, effectively ending any independence for Bosnia and Herzegovina and solidifying Austro-Hungarian rule. Post-crisis and decline of the empire. Now we will talk about the series of events that would happen after the crisis that are tied to the crisis and would ultimately lead to the continued decline and decay of the empire that would ultimately lead it and force it ultimately in the direction of the Central Powers in World War I. In 1881, France occupied the Ottoman Beylik of Tunisia with the excuse that Tunisian troops had crossed the border into their colony of Algeria, which also formerly belonged to the Ottoman Empire until 1830. A year later, in 1882, the British Empire occupied the Ottoman Caliphate of Egypt with the pretext of military assistance to the Ottomans for putting down the Arab revolt. Britain later declared Egypt a British protectorate on the 5th of November in response to the Ottoman government's decisions to join World War I, but effectively Egypt had been under British control since the initial occupation. It is worth noting that the Ottoman government had frequently declared tax revenues from Egypt as sortie for borrowing loans from the British and French banks. The Ottoman government had earlier also leased Cyprus to the British in 1878, in exchange for the British support at the Congress of Berlin in the same year. Cyprus was also later annexed by Britain on the 5th of November 1814 for the same aforementioned reason regarding the Ottoman participation in World War I. By obtaining Cyprus and Egypt, Britain gained an important foothold in the eastern Mediterranean and control of the Suez Canal, while France increased its lands in the western Mediterranean coast of North Africa by adding Tunisia to its empire as its French protectorate. This would all ultimately continue to lead to the empire's rapid decline and its decay. In conclusion, this crisis was a sign to the peoples and powers around the world that the once feared empire of the Ottomans, the conquerors of the last Rome, was frankly decaying, and was only 2 houses down from the death's door, with the last 2 houses being the Balkan Wars and the effects of the treaties of Sevres after World War I. And ultimately the step into death's door was the overthrow of the Sultan by Kemal Ataturk and his proclamation of the Republic.